Hi there and welcome to the channel of A Disappointed Man with me, Jason Kennedy, the Disappointed Man. And in this video I'll be talking about Patrick Hamilton's 1947 novel The Slaves of Solitude, having already reviewed his 1941 thriller Hangover Square. In fact, that was the very first review I did for the channel. Okay, this time we'll begin by taking a look at the author himself. Patrick Hamilton was born in 1904 in Sussex into an upper middle class family, and the dominant figure in the Hamilton household was his father, Bernard, an alcoholic, financially inept fantasist who believed himself to be the true king of Scotland. A lawyer by training, in middle age he decided to become a novelist and turned out a stream of truly wretched books which were the subject of much derision among members of the Hamilton family. Unperturbed or perhaps even spurred on by his father's literary exploits, Hamilton resolved upon a career as a writer for himself, and in 1929 he became famous overnight with his hit play Rope, which was famously turned into a movie by Alfred Hitchcock, and I'll just read you his reaction to his success. "It is not only the money, it is fame, and by this I do not mean a petty notoriety, but the real article, fame. I've done exactly what Noel Coward did with The Vortex. I am known, established, pursued. The world truly is at my feet. You reading a few notices over there cannot possibly imagine what has happened." Building on the success of Rope, Hamilton produced a stream of acclaimed novels and plays, the best known of which is probably Gaslight, from where the term gaslighting derives, a word which has so penetrated contemporary culture that in 2022 Merriam-Webster proclaimed it the word of the year. However, despite all this commercial and critical success, all was not well in Hamilton's private life. Now, I'm not usually one to dwell on the private misfortunes of writers, or anyone else for that matter, but in the case of Hamilton, there are three factors in his private life that do bear strongly upon his work. Firstly, he does appear to have great knowledge of what it means to be bullied, and there are bullying characters in many of his works, most famously of course in Gaslight, but also, as we'll see, in The Slaves of Solitude. Secondly, he was a repressed homosexual who contracted 2 sham marriages, and we also see highly repressed characters throughout his works. And thirdly, there is his legendary boozing. He could put away the equivalent of 3 bottles of whiskey a day, and Hamilton's brother Bruce calculated that in 1946 Hamilton was spending upwards of £2,000 a year on his drinking. That's at a time when you could buy an elegant townhouse in the centre of London for just £1,000. And these three aspects of Hamilton's life, bullying, the repression of strong emotion, and boozing, all play a major part in The Slaves of Solitude, to which we will now turn our attention. Now, the novel is set in 1943, and the central figure is Miss Roach, a middle-aged spinster who was previously a rather unsuccessful schoolmistress, bullied by the children who of course called her Cockroach. She's now working as a publisher's secretary in London, but 12 months previously decamped from the capital due to the German bombing and has been living in Thames Lockdown, a fictionalised Henley-on-Thames, in a lodging house, the Rosamond Tea Rooms, and it's here that most of the action takes place. We quickly learn that Miss Roach loathes life in the lodging house, and we also see that she is highly repressed. She seethes underneath the surface with anger, and her passive-aggressive behaviour manifests itself many times. She will first make a gesture of reconciliation and then immediately become incandescent with rage, which she conceals, dreaming of lashing out at her enemies, chief among whom is the abominable bully, Mr. Thwaites. Mr. Thwaites, an elderly gentleman, is a Nazi sympathiser, and he is the dominant figure in the lodging house, particularly at the meals that the residents take together, and he uses these as an opportunity to torture Miss Roach, not only with his constant insinuations that she is a closet communist, but due to Roach's unusual sensitivity to language, with his habit of trothing, the deliberate employment of archaic diction for no discernible purpose. And I'll just give you an example of this. Thwaites is speaking at breakfast here to one of the minor characters. "And dost thou go forth this bonny morn," he said, addressing Mrs. Barrett, "into the highways and byways, to pay thy due respects to good King Sol?" Mrs. Barrett, familiar, as all in the Rosamond tea rooms were, with the troth language, was able quickly to translate this and see that Mr. Thwaites was asking her if she was going out for a walk. As she went for a walk every morning, and as Mr. Thwaites knew this perfectly well, the question was totally meaningless, and was put to Mrs. Barrett solely in order that Mr. Thwaites might exercise his eccentric and exuberant prose. "Well," said Mrs. Barrett, "as a matter of fact, I've got to go round and see my doctor at 12. There was a pause as Mr. Thwaites worked out what he could do with this. "Ah," he said, "so at the hour of noon thou visiteth the man of medicines, dost thou?" "Yes," said Mrs. Barrett, "that's right." "Issuing therefrom, I take it," said Mr. Thwaites, "with divers pills and potions to heal thine ills." Mrs. Barrett did not reply to this. Regular viewers of the channel will not be surprised to learn that I found this troth language hugely entertaining. Now, Miss Roach's second enemy is Vicky, a German, and at the start of the novel, the two women are actually friends, but their relationship soon disintegrates after a series of relatively minor incidents which, in the claustrophobic atmosphere of the lodging house, quickly assume epic proportions. The first incident which incurs the wrath of Roach is when Vicky sabotages a plan the two women had agreed upon, where Roach would approach the landlady of the lodging house with a view to Vicky moving in. Instead, Vicky approaches the landlady directly and arranges the move without Roach's knowledge, and this plants the seed in Roach's mind that Vicky has a scheming nature which had previously gone undetected. She may even be a German spy. Even worse follows as Vicky forms an unholy alliance with Mr. Thwaites, flirting with him and awakening amorous inclinations in the old man which had hitherto mercifully lain dormant, and mealtimes become even more of a trial for poor Miss Roach, who now has two tormentors to contend with. But Vicky's most grievous sin in Roach's eyes is when she emerges as a potential rival for the affection of the man whom Roach calls her American, an amiable, womanizing lieutenant who supplies the novel with copious amounts of booze and its romantic interest. And with these elements in place, the stage is set for the unfolding of what Roach calls, in all seriousness, the most epic feud in boarding house history. So that's the story, and if you head over to Goodreads and peruse the reviews, that's more or less what you'll find, along of course with the obligatory star ratings. We mustn't forget those. However, at the channel of A Disappointed Man, we delve deeper into the question of what makes a book good, or, as in this case, great. Now, when I reviewed Hangover Square, I made the observation that Hamilton is one of those rare writers who can do everything well, but nothing in Hangover Square prepared me for quite how brilliant The Slaves of Solitude is. In terms of its literary ambition, it is orders of magnitude greater, the work of a mature author who rightly has supreme confidence in his abilities, and in my analysis, I will focus on two aspects that make this such a superb work of literature. Firstly, the use of a variety of narrative and cinematic techniques, and secondly, Hamilton's extremely sophisticated understanding of how language operates. I could literally speak for an hour about the narrative and cinematic techniques in this novel, but I will limit my remarks to just the first 5 chapters. And what is so unusual about this book is the way the narrative technique shifts from chapter to chapter. Most novels will settle down into a particular narrative technique and then only abandon it occasionally. If we take, for example, another great book, Denton Welch's A Voice Through a Cloud, here it's very simple. It's a first-person narrator. The time of the narration is simultaneous, so you feel that the action is taking place as the narrator speaks, and it has the occasional flashback. However, The Slaves of Solitude varies the narration throughout, and in this respect, it's a virtuoso performance. So now let's look at chapter 1. Now, the opening of the novel, which in my view deliberately echoes that of Dickens' Bleak House, establishes a third-person, omniscient, thoroughly objective narrator who speaks a kind of prose poetry, and it goes like this. London, the crouching monster, like every other monster, has to breathe, and breathe it does, in its own obscure, malignant way. Its vital oxygen is composed of suburban working men and women of all kinds, who every morning are sucked up to an infinitely complicated respiratory apparatus of trains and termini into the mighty congested lungs, held there for a number of hours, and then, in the evening, exhaled violently through the same channels. If you're not convinced that's a deliberate echo of Bleak House, please note both novels start with the same word, London. Okay, as the chapter progresses, this anonymous narrator plucks from a crowd of commuters at Thames Lockton railway station Miss Roach, the central figure of our story, and begins following her back to her room at the lodging house, on the way supplying all kinds of useful information about what we're seeing, about Miss Roach's biography, and even what she is thinking, until at the midpoint of the chapter, for the first time, we slide into free indirect discourse. Now, free indirect discourse as a literary technique is as old as the novel itself, and one of its most celebrated exponents is Jane Austen. However, Flaubert is said to be the first author to have self-consciously employed the technique, and all it denotes is when an ostensibly objective third-person narrator becomes temporarily infected, as it were, by the thoughts and feelings of a character, and this confusion arises over who precisely is speaking. Given Roach's extreme sensitivity to language, it's fitting that the first example of free indirect discourse concerns the meaning of a word, in this case the name of the lodging house itself, the Rosamond Tea Rooms. What did Rosamond mean? Why in heaven's name Rosamond? Are ye already Rosamond's tea bower or what? Mrs. Payne the landlady could not have told you, and no one else knew. Clearly the omniscient narrator who began the story would know the answer to this question of why Rosamond was chosen. They knew everything. We're left to infer that these are in fact Miss Roach's thoughts, and what we now have in the novel are two voices, both speaking in the third person, with the line between them not always easy to discern. Now, many writers will use this technique throughout the entire course of a novel, but Hamilton, very unusually, uses the chapter breaks to accomplish two things. Firstly, cinematically to cut between times and locations, and secondly, to shift narrative technique. And we see this in the transition from chapter 1 to chapter 2. This chapter jumps forward 3 weeks, and Miss Roach is sat in the cinema, mentally reviewing the events since the end of chapter 1, the most significant of which is the budding relationship between her and the American lieutenant. And what this shift in narrative technique does is grant us access to Roach as she sees herself. This is her personal narrative. Everything here is subjectively true, and when we return to the present moment at the end of the chapter, we find that the American lieutenant is sitting beside her in the darkness of the cinema. Chapter 3 jumps forward an unspecified amount of time, and it returns to the free indirect discourse of chapter 1, which makes sense because we're meeting a new character, and thus the anonymous narrator can supply us with the necessary information. Then we have chapters 4 and 5, and these work together as a single unit, and they are highly cinematic. Chapter 4 sees the return of the anonymous narrator who opened the novel. It begins at dawn while all the inhabitants of the lodging house are sleeping, and it fades in as Mr. Thwaites awakens, and we are led through a day in the life of the Rosamond Tea Rooms, allowing us, the reader, to become familiar with its rhythms and also encounter all of the minor characters. And now Miss Roach is just one more person in the story, and at the end of the chapter we have our first mention of Mr. Prest, an utterly nondescript character, seemingly of no importance whatsoever. Chapter 5 is rather extraordinary. It's like you're watching a movie And rather than focus on the hero, the camera suddenly alights upon a minor character and follows them to see where they go, because this is what happens in the case of Mr. Prest. In fact, I have just such a movie in mind. It's Luis Buñuel's The Phantom of Liberty, which I highly recommend. And in this chapter, we follow Prest all the way to London and learn about his secret life. At the end, he returns to the Rosamond Tea Rooms, and in the next chapter, the main line of the narrative resumes. Forgive me for going into so much detail. If you prefer the Goodreads approach, I'm sorry, but I just wanted to give you an idea of how carefully crafted this novel is, and all of this technical brilliance is directed at a single aim: not to confuse the reader, but on the contrary, to deliver as richly rewarding a reading experience as possible. The second part of my analysis will be much more brief. I'm going to touch upon two aspects of how Hamilton exploits the properties of language, the first of which is his establishment of unique conventions. One of them I've already mentioned. When Mr. Thwaites is happy, he will use his troth language. Another convention, however, concerns how Vicky speaks. Miss Roach, as she comes to loathe Vicky, notices she has a habit of emphasizing the indefinite article a before a noun, and what Hamilton does is, after this observation has been made, he changes from a small a to a capital A when Vicky does this. It's a most amusing quirk of the text. In the same way, when Roach mentally repeats Vicky's words, generally in horror, these are rendered in italics. And what's most satisfying is when all of these conventions are deployed together. And on the rather magical page 227, we have Thwaites using the troth language, Vicky with her capital A's, and poor Roach silently suffering in italics. The other feature of language that Hamilton exploits is called microdialogue, and this is a term coined by the Russian literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin, and it denotes the inner conversation we carry on with ourselves that helps to form our image of who we are. But his key insight was that it's not only our own voice that takes part in this conversation, but also the voices of others from the outside that help to complete this image of ourselves and turn us into fully social beings. So what's truly extraordinary in Hamilton's novel is the sheer extent of microdialogue. He really foregrounds this property of language, and it's deep inside Roach's mind that we go and we begin to understand why she feels so victimized, and actually she begins to doubt her own sanity as the novel heads towards its climax. Given all of Roach's sufferings, one is tempted to forgive Hamilton for the rather contrived ending he supplies. So there we have it, an absolute masterpiece to kick off 2023. If I read another novel this year that even approaches this one for its quality, I'll be a happy man. But for now, be safe, be strong, and I shall see you anon. Nanu nanu.